Who wrote the book of Hebrews? A scriptural assessment. I personally use Yahovah for the name of the living God and Yeshua for the name of the Son of God. However, in this video, I will be referring to the Creator as Lord and the Son of God as Jesus to avoid confusion. People have been trying to identify the author of the book of Hebrews for 1900 years. Up until the 3rd century, Paul was considered the author of the book of Hebrews. Today, however, the evidence against Paul as the author of Hebrews is just too strong for scholarly dispute. Bible scholars today do not understand how the book of Hebrews could have ever been considered to be written by Paul. Paul was a narcissist and referred to himself by name 30 times and by personal pronouns several hundred times. If Paul had written the book of Hebrews, his name would have been plastered all over it. So now let's take a look at the scriptures to see if we can shed some light on the matter. Every living thing leaves their DNA behind as markers. Writers are the same way. People have their own little phrases and idioms. So let's see if the book of Hebrews can reveal some of the writer's DNA. Our first clue is to look at the phrase, quote, taste death, end quote. We see that it is only used in Hebrews 2:9, quote, taste death, end quote. Matthew 16:28, quote, taste death, end quote. Mark 9:1, quote, taste death, end quote. Luke 9:27, quote, taste death, end quote. And John 8:52, quote, taste death, end quote. So now we have potentially limited the author of the book of Hebrews to one of the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Now we need to try and narrow the field by identifying any lesser used little phrases or idioms. Our second clue is in Hebrews 9:1-5. In describing the tabernacle, we see in Hebrews 9:2 the phrase, quote, sacred bread, end quote. Note the word G4286, prothesis, can be translated as sacred or consecrated. The only other place we find this phrase in the New Testament is in Matthew 12:4, quote, consecrated bread, end quote. Mark 2:26, quote, consecrated bread, end quote. Luke 6:4, quote, consecrated bread, end quote. So now we have lessened the possible number of those who could have authored the book of Hebrews to 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, we need to narrow the field down a little more. If we look at the phrase, quote, end of the age, end quote, we hit a home run. Hebrews 9:26 reads, quote, the consummation of the ages, end quote. Note, the word somptalia, G4930, can be translated as consummation or end. We only find this phrase in one other book in the entire New Testament, the book of Matthew. The nice thing is that the phrase is used 5 times in Matthew. Matthew 13:39, quote, end of the age, end quote. Matthew 13:40, quote, end of the age, end quote. Matthew 13:49, quote, end of the age, end quote. And Matthew 24:3, quote, end of the age, end quote. And finally, Matthew 28:20, quote, end of the age, end quote. We now have 6 exact phrases in just 2 books that are nowhere else in the scriptures. Using the writer's DNA, it looks like the author of the book of Matthew could have also been the author of the book of Hebrews. Both books have other similarities also, in that both books rely heavily on Old Testament scriptures, and neither book reveals the author's name. However, to throw a fly in the ointment, Hebrews 2:3 needs to be addressed. Hebrews 2:3 reads, quote, after it was first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, end quote. From reading this scripture, it would appear that the writer is giving secondhand information. Quote, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, end quote. Therefore, some would argue that this verse would exclude the author of Matthew as the author of Hebrews, because Matthew had first-hand knowledge of the events of the teachings and miracles of Jesus. So let's review the scripture. Looking at Hebrews 2:3 with the strong numbers, it appears the word "to us" were wrongfully added for clarity. Quote, after it was at first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. End quote. The word "to," Strong's number G3588, means some, the, this, that, one, he, she, it, these, things, this, those who, together, what, which, who, whoever, whom, etc. The word "to" does not mean, quote, to us by those, end quote. Nowhere else in the New Testament was the word "to," G3588, translated as, quote, to us by those, end quote. If we read Hebrews 2:3 with this correction, it reads, quote, after it was at first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed by those who heard, end quote. Now this corrected reading makes perfect sense. We are not dealing with second-hand news. Perhaps after 1900 years, the mystery of who authored the book of Hebrews has been solved. It appears as if the books of Matthew and Hebrews were authored by the same person.